Bonjour, je suis Philippe Shaw et vous écoutez les podcasts agricoles du Québec.
Dans les podcasts agricoles à la vie, comme à l'école, on se parle de bricoles, de choses anticoles. On se parle de tracteurs, y'a les fans, pis les menteurs. On se lève de bonne humeur, pis on compte pas nos heures. Christian Dion est là. Agricole, 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 agricole. Bienvenue dans le podcast agricole du Québec avec Christian Dion.
Hey, salut tout le monde! J'espère que vous allez bien. Christian Dion pour les podcasts agricoles du Québec. Aujourd'hui, j'ai appelé des renforts parce qu'on va faire un podcast en anglais. Puis vu que je suis pas très bon en anglais, c'est ça, j'ai demandé des renforts à Sylvain Leroux puis à Jean-Philippe Boucher. Merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté mon invitation de me donner un coup de main.
Ça fait plaisir, mon cher. Pareillement, ça fait plaisir.
Good. C'est ça, à soir, on reçoit Philippe Shaw. Philippe Shaw qui est un producteur de l'Ontario. Si vous êtes sur Twitter, c'est sûr que vous avez déjà vu passer un de ses tweets, surtout si vous êtes agriculteur. Fait que, quelqu'un qu'on connaît depuis longtemps, mais qu'on va essayer d'approfondir un petit peu plus à soir. Le connaître un peu plus. Fait que c'est pour ça, je vais essayer d'en dire un petit peu en anglais, mais je suis vraiment pas terrible. Puis on va faire.
C'est meilleur que tu penses, c'est pas mal bon.
En tout cas, j'ai vraiment pas la chance de pratiquer souvent. Il faut être honnête aussi. Là. Donc, hi, Mr. Shaw.
Bonjour, Christian. Comment allez-vous?
Very fine. And you?
I'm good tonight.
Great. Tonight, we want to know who is Philippe Shaw, where from, and all of your background in agriculture. You have a very impressive. I'm not good. But first of all, where are you from?
Well, merci, Christian. And, greetings to the audience in Quebec. It is indeed a pleasure and a privilege as a unilingual English-speaking farmer from Ontario to speak to all my friends in Quebec tonight, which I have many. And I have a long history in Quebec, such a wonderful place to be from, where Quebec farmers feel what it's like to be a Quebec farmer because they feel it in their soul. And I've had lots of opportunity to be in Quebec over my whole career. And I hope to come back someday. Hopefully we can get this COVID pandemic behind us. But I am from here. This is my farm. These are my soybeans that you see growing over my shoulders. I am from southwestern Ontario. Dresden, Ontario, which is close to Windsor, Ontario, close to Detroit, Michigan, and in the far deep south of Ontario, where I farm for a living. But of course, I do quite a few other things through the years. I went to the University of Guelph and I studied there in agricultural economics, did a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in agricultural economics. And that's where I met a good Quebec friend of mine who eventually turned out to be the Dean of Agriculture at Laval University. His name was André Gasselin, who farmed strawberries at Ile d'Orléans in Quebec City. And I spent lots of time on his strawberry farm. But after that, I kept farming and buying land, and then I started writing a column called Under the Agridome 35 years ago, an agricultural economic column, which was eventually picked up by DTN, Data Transmission Network, an American company in the United States. And so I still write for them every week across the United States and Canada. But I did that 30 years ago on a satellite network, and eventually I was picked up by the Ontario Farmer here in Ontario. And eventually, over the years, I was asked to write agricultural commodity commentary on agricultural prices and markets for the Ontario Corn Producers Association, which eventually that changed to the Grain Farmers of Ontario, where I write agricultural commentary, or mostly market commentary on prices of grain in Ontario and even in Quebec to some extent, because there's quite a grain trade across our border with Quebec. And you know, I did many other things through the years too, continued to farm, and I do a podcast in Bangladesh with a friend. I lecture in Bangladesh often. I like to get to Asia as much as I can. I also used to write farm machinery reviews. So we love Jean-Philippe Boucher in Quebec because he's such a great market analyst, but I used to do the same thing, but I would review tractors and combines at the same time. And I really enjoyed that. But that changed over the years. I don't do that anymore. And I even had a professional basketball commentary on the radio here in southwestern Ontario at one time. So there's, you know, I'm 63 years old now. I used to be a young man doing all this, and it wasn't always easy. There was lots of criticism as I grew into this, and continues to be. But I have a keen interest in agricultural markets, especially in Eastern Canada. I don't really have an affinity for Western Canadian markets because I don't try to talk about some things that I don't know. It's been incredibly fascinating to learn more about Quebec markets and Maritime Canada markets as well, because I've done a lot of speaking on markets across Eastern Canada, well, Western Canada too, and the United States. And so that just gives you a little bit of my background. Like I say, I mainly farm for a living, and these soybeans I try to get to, these are from last year. And as we all know, grain markets in Quebec and Ontario and all around the world can't get enough of what we grow. And so it's made for a very, very interesting time for all of us. And I know in my own career, these times we're nearing record price levels on the futures market. So, you know, there's much perspective to talk about. There's much going on in Quebec and Ontario with regard to price discovery and grain markets. And it continues to evolve. And we're at a very interesting point right at this time because of the tragedy that we see in Ukraine and how that's affecting markets now. But anyway, we could get into that maybe a little bit later. But that gives you a little background on me, Christian. And I guess I even write in Quebec for GrainWiz. Jean-Philippe Boucher gave me the opportunity several years ago to write a monthly column for him. And I've been doing that, and he's been translating that for several years now, where I try to reach out in my writing to Quebec producers and in French, and speak to what concerns them with regard mostly to grain markets. And so I've been in Quebec several times. I've spoken in Quebec, I think, about 4 times, 3 times, I think, for GrainWiz, once for the UPA. And of course, if you've seen my Twitter feed, you saw that I even led a big protest there in 2006 with UPA members right behind me in Parliament Hill. I think, Christian, you were with me there that day.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and the UPA, the Quebec farmers, marched in from Hull across the bridge, and we had 10,000 farmers in Ottawa that day. And I did the English part of it with Pierre Riom, who many Quebec farmers would know because he's a legend in Quebec. I knew of him, and we got to know each other. So I mean, there's lots to talk about. There's lots to talk about, and of course, I've known Sylvain on Twitter for quite some time, and we chatted.
Philippe.
Yeah.
In 2006, at Ottawa. In Ontario, at this time, you have, if I remember, 3 associations in the grain. You have the Ontario Grain Producer, the Ontario Soybean Producer, and Ontario Wheat Producer. Now is the Ontario Grain Producer. You have merged all the little association.
Wait. And Christian, if you're more comfortable asking these questions in French, just ask them in French, and I'm sure we'll understand each other somehow. Somebody will be able to help. But yes,
I have a personal producer, Philippe and Sylvain and Jean-Philippe.
Wait, like in Ontario, we used to have organizations that were separate. We had the Ontario Wheat Producers Marketing Board. We had the Ontario Corn Producers Marketing Association, and before that we had the Ontario Soybean Marketing Board. But there was the thought that in Ontario, many of us were members of each organization, and like for instance myself, I grow wheat, corn, and soybeans. And so there was the thought to join all the organizations together in Ontario. And so that's what we did several years back now. I can't remember actually when that happened, but when I started, I was writing about corn prices only. I was asked to do that by the Ontario Corn Producers, and I was asked to continue to write agricultural market commentary by the Grain Farmers Ontario. So the Grain Farmers Ontario represent all the grain farmers in Ontario now, and they have relationships in Quebec with your organizations as well, and you know, in Eastern Canada, we try to work together as much as we can.
Just for a sorry, you know, just for a comparison, with the 3 association, do you have to pay a membership at the each association?
No.
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 Because here with the UPA,
there's no longer 3 associations. It's only one.
No, yes.
You meant at the time of the 3 associations and board, did you have to be part of each of them to market grain?
Yeah. At that time, there was checkoff. There was money going to each association, but now it's only to the Grain Farmers Ontario based on so much grain that is marketed in Ontario. And that's how it works now.
And do you pay here in Quebec? We pay cotisation, Sylvain, à l'UPA.
Oui.
And we pay on each ton of grain we sell.
Oui.
$1.3.
$1.42 or $1.39.
Yeah, ben, ouais, 1,30 pour le maïs, puis 1,40 pour tous les autres grains.
Ouais.
Do we have
what Christian wants to, like, here in Quebec, there's the UPA, which is the general organization for all members and all producers. And there's one fee for that, and there's another one that is per ton or per grain marketed fee there too. Like, he was just wondering if it's the same if you have check off for each.
No, it's not the same that way. In the UPA, I have spoken in Montreal at the headquarters of the UPA. I had quite a relationship earlier in my career. We always looked at the UPA as being the model organization that we wanted in Ontario, but so I know how the funding is done for UPA in Quebec. In Ontario, it is not done that way. There are at least three general farm organizations. One is the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. We have the National Farmers Union of Ontario, as well as the Christian Farmers Organization, Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario, and producers choose which one they want to support every year.
Okay.
With the Ontario Federation of Agriculture being the largest.
Yeah.
Just continue without me. I will see my little boy. Okay.
Okay. It doesn't. For instance, they don't have the same relationship the Ontario General Farm Organizations have with the commodity or the Grain Farmers Ontario as the UPA does with the grain organizations in Quebec.
No, it's all under one roof here in Quebec, which
That's correct. And
that's
it's not
it is a strength when you want to get together to make some demands and do some very important discussions with governments, but also between producers. Sometimes it kind of a few clashes happens, but that's the way it is. I was wondering, we went on the farmers organization pretty quick. I was wondering, like, prior to get to that point, what like you were born on a farm, and you got into university, you did a master's, and then went even further, did a bachelor. Like, why? Was the economic part of farming very important to you, or were you just like really good with numbers to get so far?
No, I always felt that it was actually my father that counseled me to go to university. I wasn't interested in crop science, and I'm still not interested in agricultural science and crop science and things of that nature. I was interested in agricultural economics, okay? And I was very interested in that. I just felt that anything else from an agricultural science perspective, I could pick that up in a book, or now you can pick it up on a web page or something. But I always felt management on the farm was very important. So if I could manage the numbers, that would be a good thing to know. Little did I know that by taking agricultural economics, it gave me the basis for understanding how supply and demand works and how price discovery works within agricultural markets. So I took that at Guelph early. I went back and I farmed full time for 5 years, and I bought land and farms during that time. Then I went back and did a master's degree in agricultural economics and business, where I concentrated on market research at that point, and I actually measured farmers' psychographics across Canada. And you know what demographics is: age, income, and education. Well, I measured farmers' attitudes, interests, and opinions across Canada, and published my thesis, which was Dimensions of Canadian Agriculture. Oh. And the UPA actually published my questionnaire in French to all the people on the UPA list at that time, which was 1988, a long time ago now. And I was able to categorize French Canadian farmers, Quebec farmers, on how they felt about the world and how they felt about life and how they felt about buying agricultural inputs and markets and things of that nature. So that's what my master's thesis was about. And it gave me the background to interpret markets and how economics works. And so when I try to look at modern day events and how it affects markets, that's all working in the background. And so on the farm, I typically look at a problem. I tend to look at it from an economic standpoint almost all the time. How is this going to pay me back? How is the marginal revenue going to be greater than the marginal cost when I make farm decisions? So that was the background I had, and that's what I was lucky enough to do. I never felt that I was as smart as any of the other graduate students. I obviously had good enough marks to get in, but I just felt that I worked hard, and that's what I still do. Planting these soybeans, that's hard work, but I have no trouble with doing that. And, through hard work that, you can make up for anything else that you might not be so good at. But Sylvain, you know me, we've known each other for quite some time. Mm-hmm. And it's just a case of being open-minded and working hard and trying to be and using the tools that you have to interpret the things around you.
And all those studies got you to where you end up in life and being able to to study and understand economics on all levels and marketing. So that's basically what got you to the level of knowledge that you have now, and then we all look at right now.
Well, it's been helpful. However, everything that I do, I've been asked to do. Okay, so like for instance, Grain Farmers of Ontario asked me to interpret markets for them, and to do that. All the other publications and organizations I write for have done the same thing, as well as well, before COVID, I would speak in public a lot. I haven't done that during COVID. I've done it virtually. I don't really prefer virtual because, like for instance, when I come to Quebec, I really enjoy meeting the people and hearing their stories and learning more about what drives a Quebec farmer. And I think that Quebec agriculture is so important, and Quebec farmers are so important. But trying to understand what motivates Quebec farmers is incredibly interesting. And even your marketing system is different for hogs versus what it is here in Ontario. Your price discovery of grain is different than what it is for me, and the movement of grain and different things. So yes, I'm asked to do what I do, but and computer technology has really helped me with that, because even back in the old days when I was speaking in Quebec for the work I did for the UPA, I was using fax modems and computers to help me do the work. And it's the same thing that I do today, because what you see behind me with these soybeans, that's what I do. That's my farm, and 10 miles toward the sun is Michigan, USA. And, I farm 860 acres of land, and I do it basically by myself. My brother helps me transfer grain in the fall. But the other things I've been asked to do, and I'm paid well for them, and that's important to me. If there's an opportunity, I try to take it, and but I have the background, and if people aren't satisfied, obviously I don't, and I will no longer be asked to do that. But I try to remain relevant to the market and to the farmers that may or may not listen to me, and not everybody does, and that's okay. That's the nature of our business.
Y a-tu gelé?
Non, il attend une question ou quelque chose.
OK, je pensais qu'il bougeait plus. Il bougeait plus pantoute. Bon, là, tu étais rendu, dans le fond, l'école. Tu as parlé de l'école, Sylvain?
Ouais.
OK.
Well, what about the background behind it? Like, because I was just curious, Philip, like how many generation of your family have been producing in your area? Like, is it you? Is it your father, your grandfather?
Well, I am a fifth generation Canadian, so I know in Quebec you would have Canadians and Quebecers that go back much farther than me. For instance, my friends in Ile-de-Orléans, they go back to the 1600s in Quebec. But for myself, my great-great-grandfather landed, I think, in the Montreal area in 1837, and he actually walked down to southwestern Ontario. And he died in 1880, and he farmed south of Dresden, Ontario, where I'm from. And he had 17 children. And, at that time in 1880, there wasn't much else to do, I guess. He had 17 children. And, so most people with the last name of Shock relate back to him in this area. But he came from Northern Ireland at the time. And so then my great-grandfather farmed after him to some extent, but farming was different then, as you know. It was more like a subsistence type of thing. There was a local economy, and they had livestock and things. And my grandfather farmed, and one of the farms that I farm now, this one here, my grandfather owned that. My father bought it from him, and I bought it from my father. But it's been in my family since about World War II, right after World War II. But keep in mind, it's not Drummondville, or it's not Ile-de-Orléans, or it's not the Beauce. It's not south of Montreal. It's in the deep southwest of Ontario. So it's in an area where we don't have very much livestock. We don't have very many buildings. And it's very reminiscent of the Midwest of the United States. And so that's kind of my background of where I came from. My wife's family is originally French Canadian and came from Quebec. And my wife speaks pretty good French. She thinks she does not, but she does. And that's and I'm 63 years old now, so obviously at some point I'll have to decide what to do. But I'll probably keep writing because, you know, farming is it's been a challenging life, because the first interest rates that I paid on farm demand loans were 23.25%. Now, yesterday, the Bank of Canada raised their lending rate to 0.5%. And my first demand loans were 23.25%. And it was hard enough to get capital to farm at that time because the interest rates were so high. So, you know, through the years, there have been challenges, and we've arrived at today where JP and I were talking about high grain prices before we came on. So, you know, agriculture is constantly changing. And as farmers, the only thing that I can count on in 2022 and 2023 is more change. And markets are that way as well. And we have to continue to evolve with them. So the land that you see behind me has been in the family since after World War II, but my extended family came to the deep southwest of Ontario from Northern Ireland, landing probably in Montreal and going on in about 1837. So, you know, that's a little bit more about me and where I came from and what I do. And I do count it a privilege to have many friends in Quebec, and have actually had somewhat of an impact there. And because, you know, I think I've talked to Sylvain about this over the years, and maybe even JP, that French Canada and English Canada don't talk to each other very much. And it's not because we don't like each other. We do like each other, but we just don't have an opportunity to do that because of the language barrier. But any time that I've been in Quebec, I've always tried to sit with people that didn't understand very much English, and I certainly don't understand much French, but we always got along fine, and we learned lots from each other. And it's been a very good thing.
When your first generation at your farms arrive, what you do? Milk cow, grow corn, or?
I don't know, Christian.
Okay.
Je ne sais pas. I don't know. You know, that was so long ago. I never, of course, never knew. You know, at that time in the deep southwest of Ontario, these trees that you see here, it would have been forested area, and it probably would have been more of a subsistence agriculture where you just fed your family. Over a period of time, like these soybeans that you see are all exported to Asia now, just like a lot of non-GMO soybeans in Quebec are exported to Asia. So in the deep southwest of Ontario, where I'm from, we have the longest growing season of anywhere in Canada. So we grow a lot of tomatoes here, seed corn, sugar beets. A lot of grain crops were grown here years ago before they were grown in Quebec. And now it has evolved into my farm, where all my soybeans go to Asia. And of course my corn, I don't grow a lot of corn. I'm not a big corn grower, but you know, a third of that goes to ethanol here in Ontario. And similar to in Quebec, we don't have much of a feed market here in the deep southwest of Ontario, not like you do in Quebec, where it's a very dynamic thing. Plus you're closer to exports, but yeah.
And your area it's a comment on pourrait dire ça, maraîcher?
Help me out, Sylvain.
Yeah, it's more like you guys like. It's a very horticulture type of production.
Well, the tomatoes are produced here. We grow a lot of tomatoes in the deep southwest of Ontario, and when I say the deep southwest, I mainly mean Chatham-Kent and Essex near Windsor, and Lambton counties near Sarnia. We're the most farthest south in the province, and that has given us a climate where tomato production can thrive, and also seed corn is grown here. For instance, some of the seed corn that you grow in Quebec would be grown here, and it's because of the climate we have, which is much warmer than you have in Quebec, and you know, we grow much longer heat unit corn and things of that nature. So is there horticulture adaptation? There is certainly some of that, but we don't really consider tomatoes horticulture, you know, and cucumbers and things of that nature. There are fruit crops as well, not quite like Niagara, but we grow peaches here as well. And for instance, my Quebec colleague that I studied with, who went on to be the dean at Laval, he did a lot of his work. He has greenhouses all over Quebec now, but he did a lot of his early work in Leamington, in the southern part of the deep southwest of Ontario. And so, you know, it is a unique area, but maybe not as unique as it once was, because there's corn grown all into New Brunswick now, versus a time when it was mainly centered down this way. But it is an interesting area. We also have French Canadian populations here, where French is spoken, and you know, so it's a very unique area. But if you think about it in terms of, we have more heat than almost anywhere else in Ontario and Quebec. And because of that, we tend to grow bigger yields, especially on corn. And so that's what it's like here. And of course, it's culturally different than Quebec. It's culturally different than the rest of Ontario, but even within Quebec, there's differences. So, you know.
And you have a tomato producer in your area, but do you buy again Heinz ketchup for your home?
It's interesting because Heinz shut down their plant in the deep southwest of Ontario a couple of years ago, and I've written quite a bit about that, because with the Canadian dollar the way it is, that tomato production is very profitable in southwestern Ontario. It was more a corporate decision from Warren Buffett at that time to shut down the Heinz plant in Leamington. And so I went into the grocery store that day and I wanted to buy some ketchup, and I said to the grocer, I do not want Heinz ketchup because they shut down the plant in Leamington, Ontario. And the person just looked at me rather strangely, and you know, I got lots of Heinz ketchup for you to buy here. And I said, I don't want it. I want to buy Canadian ketchup. And so as you know, there was pushback on social media about that to some extent. And the Heinz plant in Leamington was sold to a group of investors who now produce processed tomato products again. Now, it's very controversial here because they have not agreed to, they've broken up the collective marketing system for tomato pricing in this area. And so they produce different vegetable products, different tomato products, but the Heinz plant is gone. So to answer your question, no, I prefer not to use Heinz ketchup because of some of the problems that they caused in southwestern Ontario. But the bigger story about that is the marketing for tomatoes. The collective bargaining process was actually broken up because of that. And it's the typical view. It's just like what JP would talk about in Quebec. If you're buying corn in Quebec, you want it as cheap as you can buy it. And if you're selling corn, you want it as expensive as you can sell it. In Ontario, the tomato processors wanted it cheaper than they were getting it. And they were actually able to do that, to get cheaper tomatoes, because some growers agreed to do that. I wouldn't say it's been totally a success story, because as you all know, probably, you can grow more profit growing corn now in southwestern Ontario with less risk than you can tomatoes. Even though tomatoes were an extremely profitable crop, where you would gross maybe $3,000 an acre or more, but the cost to grow them was very high. And so, you know, the reality in the marketplace now is that grain is a lot less risk, and the price it's at is better than some of the horticultural crops that we have. So the adjustments that were made in the marketing process in tomatoes at this time are kind of have served as a problem. But it's interesting, because it used to be, like, for instance, in Quebec, and I'm not sure, but I would assume that some of the supply managed sectors within the province have driven the land prices to some extent. They certainly have in Ontario. But where I'm from, in the deep southwest of Ontario, tomato production was the driver of land prices for a long, long time, because it was the most profitable crop to grow. And it typically was the best land. And, you know, that's changed to some extent now, because we all know what land prices have done. I'm not sure what farmland is selling for in Quebec, but it's very expensive in some parts of Ontario at prices that I could have never dreamt of. Not really reflective of the productive value of the land, but it is what it is. So I hope that answers your question, Christian, of whether I use Heinz ketchup or not. It's a complicated answer.
Great. We have Jean-Philippe have to quit.
Sorry.
Un gros merci, Jean-Philippe, de ta participation. Fait que
on se reprend n'importe quand. Je suis vraiment désolé. J'avais vraiment juste 1 heure ce soir. Et c'est toujours un plaisir d'être avec toi pour des podcasts. Philippe, it's always a pleasure. I really need to leave. I just had an hour tonight. But we'll catch up eventually, that's for sure. And I'll try to find another way of inviting you again in Quebec. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you.
That would be fun, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Salut, monsieur.
always.
Salut.
merci beaucoup.
Have a good podcast. Bye-bye.
OK, excuse-moi Sylvain, c'est pas ça que je voulais faire. C'était Jean-Philippe que je voulais comme effacer, puis finalement, il est parti avant que je clique. Bon. Great. Philippe, in your area in Ontario, do you sell your corn in metric tons or in bushel? Because here we use metric tons. The truck go on the big balance, and that's it.
Wait. The answer to your question is varied depending where you are in Ontario. Where I am from, we sell and we buy and we think in bushels. That's the price of, that's how we quote prices. About Highway 400 in Ontario, if you go north of Toronto, the Highway 400 goes from Toronto to Barrie, and east of Highway 400, grain is priced in metric tons all the way east into Quebec and New Brunswick. And I don't know why, other than it might have been more of a livestock application in the early days, where grain was bought in tons to feed the livestock. But where I'm from, in southwestern Ontario, it was, and it's still quoted in bushels. And when I speak in Quebec or when I go into Eastern Ontario, I usually need to update myself on how much grain is worth per ton, because I don't think about that.
Here in Quebec, we mixed two systems.
Okay.
For the yield in the corn or in soybean, it's metric tons by acres.
Okay.
That the metric system and the English system.
Right.
But in my case, I'm okay to full metric ton by hectare. Comment on dit ça hectare en anglais, Sylvain?
Hectares.
Hectares.
Yeah. No, we're pretty funny that way in Quebec. I mean, you probably know, Philip, but it's usually we'll do our yields in metric tons over acres. We'll do our pesticides applications on liters per acres.
Yes.
It's somewhat confusing, but more and more producers, like younger generations now, are more like metric to metric. It's getting there with technology. Kind of, it's very hard to mix, but they do. Like combines can give us like volume over area in metric ton and area over acres, but it's like you guys are mainly bushels. That's how things are measured in the area.
Well,
mainly.
one of the reasons we're bushels is because 10 miles to the west of us in the United States, it's all bushels. And that grain comes across the border and goes back. And, the volumes are great. And so I think that's why it was that way. But I've noticed in Quebec and in Ontario, I've noticed this as well. The younger people, half my age or so, are more adept at working in metric tons and metric volumes. I work in liters per acre as well. But I some of these things, younger people in Quebec and younger people in Ontario, temperature is the big one too. You see, I'm so close to the Americans that I listen to Detroit, Michigan weather reports for my farm, and all the temperatures are in Fahrenheit. And of course, but I can operate in Celsius, but younger people never even think about Fahrenheit temperatures. While a person like me, I grew up that way. So,
for me, the Fahrenheit is good for a pool and the barbecue.
Wait.
And
well, how far are you from the American border, Christian? And how far are you?
2 hours of road.
Okay.
Yeah, about the same. Like the closest American border is would be New York State for us.
Yes.
Something like that. Vermont.
Yes.
Still, I have to go across
New York.
Montreal. And,
la colle, tu traverses à Champlain, New York.
Yep.
And of course, we haven't been crossing that border very much because of the testing that's required for COVID. Hopefully that'll change soon, so we can make it a little bit. Hopefully, COVID becomes over with, so we can go down there a little easier. But crossing the American border here is before COVID, it was very normal to do that for almost anything, right? And I imagine that in Quebec, Christian, maybe your family went, or did you ever go to Lake Champlain for a weekend, or
no,
in New York? No,
no.
I thought there was a very popular beach in Lake Champlain. A lot of Montrealers went down.
Montrealers, yes.
Okay. Okay. We're too busy in the summer to do that.
Yep.
Yes.
So anyway, the relationship between the American side and down here has always been very similar. Like a lot of people would say that they can't tell the difference between me and somebody that lives in Michigan. But anyway, that's just Canadians all across the close to the border may reflect like that. But yeah, so but there's nobody as unique as Quebecers within Canada. You know, and I always appreciate my Quebec contacts and what they tell me.
In your area, near Dresden, how much for 1 acre of land? The
Well,
price.
tomato land that grows tomatoes, you know, some of it is sold for $22,000 an acre for some of the best land. That is less than land sold in other parts of Ontario that isn't as good and doesn't have as much heat. I think there's even been some land sell for $25,000, but that's the very best land. There's lots of land for sale here that would sell for $12,000 an acre, or maybe $15,000 an acre for heavier clay land. Maybe it's a little bit less than that. I'm not sure. That's just what I've heard. And of course, that's much higher than it used to be. Land in the Oxford County area, near Woodstock, Ontario, and of course closer to the Greater Toronto area, is much higher than that. I do not know what the price of land is in St. Hyacinthe or in the Montreal area. You guys could tell me how much.
Yeah, per acre in my area, we're close to 12,000. Okay. There's some that were priced even higher than that. Like you say, anything that is surrounding any suburban area goes for a lot more.
Okay.
Because of even though in Quebec we do have a law that prevents buildings or development for residential areas on farmland being zoned farmland, still there's a lot of people who are buying it in the forecast of maybe one day seeing that restriction being lifted. I don't know, Christian, you guys are quoi comme prix à peu près dans les mêmes 12-15 000 de l'acre? En tout cas, 11 000, 12 000 de l'arpent, facile?
Oui. Puis en location, j'ai entendu parler de pas loin de 400 là, dans mon coin.
L'arpent? L'acre?
L'acre.
See, like we're very like we're talking in three different measurements. Arpent, I forget what it is in English.
Yeah.
It's the old French.
Ouais, arpent, c'est une mesure française.
Okay. We still use that, acres and hectares.
Okay. Well, Christian, are you near Drummondville?
Yes. About 25 minutes from Drummondville.
Wait, okay.
He's not far from the St. Lawrence River. Like some of his land is even in the low level. C'est-tu dans les zones inondables, une partie?
Oui, dans mes terres.
Ouais.
Ben, aux abords du lac Saint-Pierre.
Yeah. He's right near the Lac Saint-Pierre area.
Okay.
So he's got good land.
I find it interesting. I don't know if you fellows follow Andre Saint-Pierre on Twitter.
Yes.
I know Sylvain does, but his farm is, oh my goodness.
André is Rimouski.
Wait. Well, it's past Rimouski, isn't
it's very, 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 very far. Far,
on the
far
north
away.
Side.
Yeah.
It's on the north side?
Yeah.
No, the South Banks.
Wait.
And
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's, you know, he has beautiful pictures that he posts from St. Lawrence, and you know, that's very far north.
André, il est sur le bord de la 132 au Bic, avant d'arriver à Rimouski un peu.
Ouais, c'est ça.
Je sais pas si tu as déjà été chez eux, j'ai déjà été, moi.
How about the land south of Montreal? Land south of Montreal toward the border. How much is it? How much is land trading for there? How much is that?
C'est en haut de 20.
Okay. Ouais, j'ai pas de valeur exacte. Christian mentions maybe something like 20,000 an acre. but it like anywhere else, it varies, and there's a lot of land in those areas that are suitable for many other crops, like vineyards. Some of them might be worth a little more.
And how about in the Beauce? How about in the Beauce?
Beauce, I don't know. Je connais pas personne dans ce coin-là. Toi, dans Beauce, as-tu des...
Aucune idée des prix dans la Beauce.
Beauce is known for its maple syrup, and yes, there's some...
Animal production.
Pig and animal.
And how about Lake Saint-Jean?
I don't know. Je sais pas, Lac Saint-Jean, le prix des terres. It's not even close to what Montreal or any other suburban area.
Oh, I know, but they have quite a few dairy farms up there.
Yeah, it's highly animal production. Although in some of the area, Robertval, it's getting more and more cash crop.
Okay.
They are doing canola, cereals, some corn, but canola being the price it is, some of them are just amazing. And it gets better and better at what they're doing, so getting good yields too.
Yes, yes.
In Ontario, do you have some program for to install bande riveraine?
Okay, he wants to know, like, on the environmental protection programs, you guys in Ontario, do you have anything? We are getting restricted, but we are getting some programs on the federal level. There are some of the growing forward programs, stuff like that. He was wondering in Ontario, where are you guys at in those in that regard?
No. In terms of restrictions, there are really no particular government restrictions. There's certainly recommendations and things like that to lower phosphate.
I have to quit. I went to see my little boy.
Okay.
Okay. There's certainly some restrictions on, or there's not the restrictions that you refer to in Quebec.
Okay.
You know, that may come, but like, for instance, how much restrictions is there for hog manure in Quebec?
I don't know the exact limitations. It's basically per animal phosphorus production. Like how many phosphorus you're allowed to export or apply, and this is all by a fertilizer program online. Like if your phosphorus levels are too high, you can't apply above such level.
We have similar type things as that, but not too much else. Now there has been there's been talk of increased regulation regarding fertilizer use and things like that, but of course that was before the realities that we have with the war going on now in Ukraine and the way prices have gone. So I do not know. I do not know exactly. That's more of a political question, and I try to stay away from politics. I enjoy reading about it, but I don't really have much of an opinion politically, other than to treat people properly. So with regard to environmental regulation, I think that's more of a political question in Ontario, and the Ontario Premier Mr. Ford is not big on that, except for the fact that protecting the Great Lakes and fresh water in Ontario would be a big thing. And with regard to hog production and things of that nature, it's probably almost as restrictive as it would be in Quebec, because you have similar issues with regard to protecting the lakes and the water.
There's a lot of demand here from the public to be more responsible on those subjects. But in Ontario, so there's no incentives, or are there? I think I remember U.S. having some programs to help or keep or enroll land in renewable or regenerative programs, keep land, grassland, and stuff like that. There's anywhere in your area anyway that
there have been incentives through the years, but they've been more of a I was going to say hodgepodge. I don't know how you translate that into French, but it hasn't really been too organized through the years. There has been times where you're paid for residue to leave on the land. There are different government programs that you can get involved in to change equipment and do a few things, but they're not funded very well. You know, so nothing too onerous as of yet, but we'll see how that goes in the future. Of course, we pay the same. I guess you would pay a little different carbon tax than we do, but that's an ongoing thing to reduce carbon in agriculture, and so there's programs with regard to try to help with that, but nothing too onerous so far. But that might change.
Politics again.
Yes, there's a lot of that. And but you know, I've always felt in Quebec, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but in Quebec, René Lévesque said that, you know, if you pay taxes and you live in Quebec, you are a Quebecer. And at one time he said, if we want our own country, we have to learn how to feed ourselves. So, you know, Quebec always had a much richer agricultural policy, and I don't mean necessarily economically. It just tended to be much more well thought out, and it tended to be much more about Quebecers than in Ontario, where it wasn't necessarily about us; it was about cheap food. and so there are differences there.
Yeah.
Philippe, the name Agridome. How this name is born?
The Agridome, the name of the Agridome came from a place in New Zealand. And early on, when I was a very young person, there used to be an agricultural television show in Windsor, Ontario, and it was called Agriscope. That was the name of the show, Agriscope. And the host of the show used to say, this week, under the Agriscope, we are putting this issue on the show. And he would say, under the Agriscope. So when I visited New Zealand in 1984, I went to a place called the Agridome, which is an agricultural show near Rotorua, New Zealand. It's basically a show for sheep. It's a sheep show. And they have a large structure called the Agridome. So when I started my column over 35 years ago, I named it Under the Agridome, as I would put agricultural issues underneath this facade of the Agridome to look at every week. And so that's where the name Agridome came from. And when I started on Twitter about 12 years ago, that's the name I took, and that's what my column's called. And I don't think lots of people that read my writing would probably not know that because I write market trends for the Grain Farmers of Ontario, and I write other commentary for other companies, and it's just my byline, just my name. But that's where Agridome comes from. That's the story why that word is what it is. And there are others that go by that name or try to go by that name, but they're very small. They don't have the following that I do. But that's where it came from. It came from New Zealand originally. And if you go to New Zealand, you can actually visit the Agridome in a place called Rotorua, New Zealand, on the North Island. And I've been there a couple times. So.
Okay. Yeah, and bon, you say this. You are on Twitter from 12 years ago, and
yeah, I think it was 2009, and that's probably where I met both of you. And
it was not on then.
I
came on in 15.
Okay, well, you know, I remember you very clearly, Sylvain, because you would comment to me from time to time. But our interactions was always very pleasant. But I think at that time I commented a lot more on Twitter. I seem to try to answer everybody. I don't try to answer anybody anymore. It's just too hard. But yeah, I started in 2009, and at that time, the story was I was writing for the Grain Farmers of Ontario, I believe at the time, and the editor of Grain Farmers of Ontario wanted to see me at a meeting. She wanted to see me, and that was a bit unusual because a lot of my editors I really don't know. So I got to the meeting and she came toward me, and she was a very young, attractive, 20-something-year-old female editor from Newfoundland. And we sat down and had a chat. And she said to me, and I'm much older than her, and she said to me, I want you on Twitter. And I knew a little bit about Twitter. And I said, I don't want to be on Twitter. I don't want to follow anybody. I don't want anybody following me. And she looked back at me and she said that she found Twitter very useful and that she'd found out a lot of things on Twitter. And she said, Phil, if you want to be a real pro, you got to be on Twitter. And so I looked back at her and I said, okay, I'll go home and I'll get on Twitter. So this, you know, think of this. This is a young 20-something young lady telling me, if you want to be a real pro, you got to be on Twitter. So I went home, I got on Twitter that night, and within 5 minutes of being on Twitter, I realized how useful it was to me, because I could put all of my work on Twitter and people could read it, or I could make comment on Twitter and people would read it. And if I put good content on Twitter, people might follow me. And for the most part, not all, but for the most part, it was a very positive experience of making friends and meeting people. Both of you, I've had dinner with both of you, okay, in Drummondville a few years ago. I've known you for several years. We don't speak the same language, except we're friends, and we get along fine. But without Twitter, we would not know each other. Okay.
Yeah.
And so on Twitter, I believe we make friends first. However, I do find it was a tremendous, at that time, it was a tremendous way to gather information and put information out there. And learn from different people. And like, for instance, with my writing about markets and about agriculture, I have friends all over the world, in Brazil, in Argentina, in the Ukraine, in Russia, in Sweden, in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Quebec, in Saskatchewan, in the United States, everywhere, that tell me what's going on in their world. And I found that very useful, and I found it it's a very dynamic place to be. Now, there was negatives as well. There was negatives, but the way I got around that was I make Twitter lists, and I think I follow about 4,600 people on Twitter, but there's no way I can follow that many. So I have specific lists of people that I look at every day, and I mainly follow the lists, and it makes Twitter a very powerful medium. So I find it very useful. I've noticed through the years, though, that I think maybe some people do not, but I find it very useful, and it's a way to make friends. And now you can translate, so I can translate any language, whether that's Bengali, Russian, Ukrainian, French, English, whatever. I can translate. I got letters, or not letters, I got email from people in South America that were trying to speak to me in Spanish and English in the early days of Twitter, because they were so interested to know somebody that knew something about grain prices in North America and how that might relate to South America. But now on Twitter, I like, for instance, if Christian tweets, or either one of you tweet in French, or you're talking to each other, the technology is there for me to get an idea of what you're talking about. It might not be perfect. And it's the same thing with you. If I'm speaking to somebody in English, you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. At the same point, if we went to China and we had our smartphone and we were using something like Google Translate, we could have the merchant speak to our phone and they translate the Chinese into French or English and we could read what they wanted. So these technologies have really helped connect the world. And with regard to Twitter, that's how it all started with me, with a young person telling me to get on, to be a real pro. And she was right. You know, she was right. And that's the way I've met you. That's the way I've met JP. Some of you may know Elena Naroba, who is a Ukrainian grain trader. Some of you might follow her. Well, you know, I've talked to her during this terrible time in Ukraine, right? She invited me to speak virtually in Ukraine last year. And so, you know, if you use it correctly, it's a very valuable thing. And it might not quite be what it used to be, but I find it very powerful for me and very useful, very useful. And, you know, I'm hoping to visit both of you on your farm someday. You know, I hope to. I think that's a beautiful pictures both of you got behind you. And I hope you can come here as well. Yeah, because on Twitter we make friends, right? And I mean, some of the people we meet on Twitter don't seem too friendly. but you know, I don't get that. But we also learn and learn about markets, learn about agriculture, learn about, like Christian, for instance. Christian has a lot of different machinery I like looking at that he uses. And I you know, don't often know where you're doing it, but I enjoy watching some of the things you're doing. And I try to understand. And you know, so Twitter has been a vehicle for me to reach out. And, you know, I publish a podcast from our videocast, a YouTube channel from Bangladesh on global issues that I talk to. I've got a large Bangladeshi following of people in Bangladesh, and I go there often to do things. And so, I mean, it's been a great way to reach out.
And that's I love from Twitter. You know how the farming is work in Illinois, in the many places. And I've seen in Illinois or here, the Illinois don't plant 2 weeks before us.
Yeah.
Yeah. We plant corn at the same time.
No.
Yeah. That's I love from Twitter.
Yes.
I follow most from agriculture on Twitter, because I want to learn about the different place in the world.
Yeah. Do you ever talk to French farmers in France?
Yes. I follow a lot of French farmer from France.
Yeah. So, you know, and of course, we don't have to speak the same language. I got asked the other day, do you understand Arabic? And I said, no. But I translate it through the software, and I understand. And so that's very powerful.
Yeah, the translate button on the at the bottom of the tweet, I like
it. Helps.
I like
it helps. Like, for instance, I have a lot of Bangladesh friends, and they tweet in Bengali, which is a different script. It's a totally different letters, but it just translates, and I know what they're talking about.
You have a great relation with Bangladesh.
Oui.
Do you tell us about the agriculture of Bangladesh?
Well, the way that started, when I did my master's degree in agricultural economics, I became friends with a fellow by the name of Enamel Hawk. Enamel was a fellow doing his master's degree and PhD at the University of Guelph, where I was. And I invited him down to my farm, and we became great friends. And through the years, we remained friends. He went on to do his PhD in resource economics, and now he's a professor at East West University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. But we did everything together for years, and we continue to do it. And now with technology, I talk to him all the time. And we even went to Quebec City together back in the days. And there's quite a famous picture we took in front of the UPA headquarters with UPA people. And anyway, but I've been back to Bangladesh 7 times since then, visiting him and going throughout the country. It's a country, when I first went there in 1993, there was 92 million people there. It's a country the size of a little bit bigger than New Brunswick. Now there's 160 million people there. It's a country with gross domestic product increases of, or economic growth increases of about 8% per year. So over a period of 30 years that I've been there, I've seen poverty decrease. And you can see that tangibly on the street, that people aren't as poor as they once were. They managed to feed themselves in that country. They import some food, but they managed to feed themselves. So they grow a lot of rice to feed a large domestic market, 160 million people. That's right beside India, which has 1.3 million people. When you think about Indian agriculture, think about the large domestic market to consume agricultural commodities, food. It's just huge, and Bangladesh is the same. You know, in Quebec and Ontario, we think about producing corn, using some of it for animal feed and ethanol, and then exporting it out. Hopefully we can export the corn. Well, it's because we're small. We're a small country compared to other countries. Well, other countries have huge domestic markets, and Bangladesh is like that. So they grow an awful lot of rice, which they feed their population. But of course, they grow everything else as well. A lot of oilseed, whether it's sunflowers or rapeseed or canola. But most of it is consumed right there. But the country is getting richer and richer and richer and richer, and poverty is going down. And so, you know, when I'm there, there's a larger middle class now. And I walk in the fields. I go out into the fields and I actually talk to the farmers. Generally, we don't talk the same language, but I have translators. And, you know, it's a very interesting to me. And it's all because of the friend I met at the University of Guelph many, many years ago. And you can go to YouTube and you can watch us. Once a month, we talk about global issues. And this month, we're talking about social media versus legacy media and who is telling the truth. We have a long discussion, you know. And of course, when you and I watch the newscasts about Ukraine, we always wonder, well, what is the truth there? Because in war, the first casualty of war is truth. So, you know, that's a little bit about Bangladesh. I hope to get back there again someday. It's a lot easier to fly there now than it used to be. And it's given me more of a global perspective when I think about these things and how the world works. But because, you know, it's a big world out there, and not everything operates like it does here in Ontario and Quebec, and it's interesting to look about, certainly interesting to visit.
Okay. And in the past, you have make some podcast.
Yes.
Before the podcast was popular like like now. Okay.
Yes, I had a podcast for many years. I used to be on the radio here. I did radio commentary for 7 years in Chatham, Ontario. Every week I had a radio commentary where I talked about agricultural economics and markets. I did that for 7 years until that came to an end. And during that time, I podcasted that every week, and it was on Apple Podcasts. But that would be 20 years ago when I did that. So that was before podcasts were very popular, and I still do one. You can go to the Grain Farmers of Ontario website, and you can click on markets and market trends, and you can listen to a monthly podcast that I do. Well, it's 14 times a year. that I do on grain markets. You can listen to me podcasting that. And I also do the video cast from Bangladesh. I even did a professional basketball podcast for 1 year for a company. And I don't do that anymore either. So, you know, I've had quite a bit of podcasting experience through the years, and I still do it, but I don't do my personal one that I used to do. My wife actually got cancer back in 2014, and luckily she survived that. But at that time, I had to throw things out of I had to stop doing so much because I had to take care of her. And she's all better, but we were lucky because you don't always survive those things. But I had to stop it at that time. I could do it again, but I mean, Christian, you know how much work it is to do. And it's, you know, computers help, but it's still, you have a schedule to meet. And I think my podcasting days from a personal standpoint are over. But like I say, I still do it for the Grain Farmers of Ontario 14 times a year.
Do you add the president of the Grain Farmer of Ontario in the past?
Okay, you're going to have to help me out. I know the chairman of the Grain Farmers of Ontario.
Est-ce qu'il a déjà été le président, mettons, des producteurs de grains de l'Ontario?
I was wondering, in your heydays of grain producer, were you ever on the board of the grain or corn or president of any of the organization? Even in
I was vice president of some local organizations at the time, many years ago. However, I never aspired to. How should I say this? I never aspired to be part of a member organization. I am a member of the Grain Farmers of Ontario, and I help sell. You know, I helped sell memberships when the original membership drive was going years ago, but I never did that. However, as you know, in 2006 we had a large protest on Parliament Hill where farmers came together, and I was asked to lead that, the English part of that, by the many farm groups in Ontario. For whatever reason, maybe it was because I could speak in public, who knows? But I was asked to do that. So I did. I have led farmers before, and that was an example of that. But no, I support the local and the provincial organizations that represent farmers in Ontario. But I've never had the motivation to lead more than that. Politics is something that I find interesting to think about, but I really have no interest in politics other than just thinking about it and reading a little bit about it. And, you know, if you're involved in farm organizations, a large part of that is, at a certain level, as you get into leadership, is about politics. And we've got good people in Ontario to do that. They don't need me to do it. I'd be glad to help, and I suppose I did back in 2006 when I led protests. But no, I don't see myself being part of that. I try to support the many people that do.
Demande, dis donc, Sylvain, s'il y a de la relève chez eux.
Christian wants to know, you are the 5th generation on the farm. Is there going to be, or do you have any 6th generation working their way up?
That's yet to be determined. It doesn't. It's yet to be determined at this point. I haven't got those plans made yet. It's something that is on my mind. I actually don't talk about it very much, and the reason I don't is because a few years ago I wrote a column about growing older on the farm and as you farm, and the next thing I knew, almost everybody was asking about buying my land, or they thought I was going to retire or something. All kinds of rumors started, and I just thought, I'll never write that column again. So That's yet to be determined. You know, yeah, I'm 63 years old now, but I used to be a young man in my 20s when this all started. And, you know, I often say that, well, physically I'm not what I used to be, but I'm a lot smarter. I'm as smart as I used to be. Now, with regard to smart decisions on the farm type of thing, but with regard to farming, both of you gentlemen are younger than me. And you are farming very successfully, and I know both of you, and I see you farm. But as you grow older, it can become more dangerous, okay? So the important thing is to farm, but farm safely. And as you grow older, you have to be more cognizant of your own particular safety. And it becomes a little bit more difficult as you grow older. So I'm very cognizant of that. And I'll have to retire at some point in the future. But that's yet to determine how that's going to work. And I'm working on that at the present time. Also, too, when you have a large public forum like I do, because people know me in Ontario, especially in rural areas, because of my background and of writing and, you know, speaking through the years, I just tend to keep my private life somewhat private. You know, you guys both know me. I don't talk about family on Twitter or anything like that. Yeah. Simply because in the past there's been some issues with people that you know, you don't need to at least the way I felt about it is that I don't talk about those things because they don't need to be known. You know, I've got a personal life and a business life, and that's how I separate it. And it's just better that way. It's just better that way. So, yeah, obviously I won't be able to continue into perpetuity in the future, but I haven't yet to figure out how that's going to transition into something else. So, but it's something that's top drawer right now, that's for sure.
And it's similar everywhere. Like there's no set point in time for retirement, and there's no guarantee for a continuum in the farm in many cases. So it's not just in your or mine, or I don't know about Christian, but anyway, it's a private matter that needs to be addressed at the right time, not too early and not too late.
Yeah, and I think that it's evolving as well with the high price of land and equipment. There's going to have to be some innovative arrangements, and I'm not exactly sure what that will be.
Exactly.
How do you see the future of agriculture in Canada?
Colic.
Huh? Tough question.
A big question.
Tough question.
We haven't talked much about the price of grain tonight, but I wrote a column a few weeks ago. Well, it'd be a month or two ago now. Yeah. And I talked about the market wanting almost anything we have now. And you can see that, whether it's corn, wheat, soybeans, canola, or livestock.
Yeah.
This market wants more than we can give it right now. And frankly, in my career, I've never seen this before. And that's a long career, and I've seen a lot. You know, we're used to, if there's a demand for something, usually supply fills that up and we get it. But I bet you both of you are waiting on something now, whether it's equipment that you bought or parts that you need or something that a new truck that you'd like or something that you're waiting because there's supply constraints. The supply needs to catch up to the demand that is there. And so when you look at the future of Canadian agriculture, it's hard to paint it in a negative sense right now, because I have never seen demand for things so high where supply has not caught up for it. I frankly have never seen it, and I've been around. I've been doing this 40 years, and in my position, usually you feel that you should have a good grasp of the future, but I can honestly say that I did not anticipate how low interest rates would affect Canadian agriculture. And the way low interest rates affected Canadian agriculture is that it made capital much more available for expansion during the last 10 years. Somebody like myself had to borrow money at much higher costs, and it seemed to take forever to get out from under that, get out from under the debt load. However, we've transitioned into an agricultural economy where the idea of debt did not matter as much. And in fact, paying off the debt did not matter as much. So I can honestly say that I missed that as an agricultural economist or as a farmer. Like all my friends, maybe including both of you, think that I should work harder and buy more land and keep working. But I missed that. But we're still there. We're still there. And I remember my father said to me, long before he passed, he said to me, how do you know that land will not be $10,000 an acre someday? And of course, I remember looking at him like thinking, my goodness, you know, land's $5,000 an acre. Why would it ever be 10? It's hard for me to imagine. But now we're over twice that here, right? So you ask a good question, Christian. You ask a good question. Like, you know, it would seem like the future is very bright based on the demand for the agricultural commodities that we have. But keep in mind, the reality in Canada and in Quebec is different than other countries. For instance, in the last 3 years, in the United States, the government injected $31 billion into farmers' pockets, based on the crops that they grow, which are the same crops that all three of us grow. At the same time, all three of us did not get anything like that, okay? So there's different realities for different countries, but you and I have to compete against that, our American friends. And we like our American friends, but you know, part of the pent-up demand for things had to do with the capital that was put into the U.S. agricultural economy. So is there a future for Canadian agriculture? Well, yes, I think there is, but we're going into this with our eyes wide open because the Canadian government and the Quebec government will probably not support Canadian farmers and Quebec farmers as well as our American friends will, and others in Europe and other places. So, you know, the future can be bright for Canadian agriculture, but you have to do a better job than me of having a vision for what that might be and be right about it. Be right about it. You'll also need an awful lot of money, an awful lot of capital to make it work. And frankly, I just have a hard time figuring out how that is going to work. Maybe it means that farms just continually get bigger. Like all three of us talk to our friends in Western Canada from time to time. And they have huge farms, you know, like there's one fellow we talked to on Twitter. He's very critical of Mr. Trudeau, but he farms about 13,000 acres, you know, and there's another fellow out west I know that I talked to on Twitter. He farms about 70,000 acres, 70,000 acres. So there's differences all across our country, and the economic realities are different for each one of us. And so, and the realities are different depending on how governments treats us as well. And I do think that our Canadian agricultural policy needs some work, and because our country is so diverse, that Marie-Claude Beaubeau from Quebec, the agriculture minister, has many different demands on her, and it's difficult for her to get a comprehensive agricultural policy, something that we were demanding back in 2006. So I don't know if that answers the question that you asked me, because unless you're in the business, there might be opportunities for you in support levels in agriculture, but in terms of farming, it's going to take a lot of capital and to remain in this business over a period of time.
Great. That it's what a tough question. Yes.
Yeah.
And now, Philippe, I will end this podcast.
Well, let me thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for inviting me. It is certainly a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be able to speak in my own language to my French, Canadian partners and friends and farmers all across Quebec. I feel honored to be asked. And I've always felt honored every time I've gone to Quebec to speak there and to learn from Quebec farmers and listen to them and what they're thinking. It's one of the most unique places in Canada to go to learn about Canadian agriculture, and I just love it, and I can't wait to get back one of these days.
Great, and the honor is for us. Thank you for accept this invitation. It's the first podcast in English for me.
You did well, really well.
And you have a lot of experience in podcasts, you. But me, I begin. It's my first year. I have make a 1 year complete.
You've done very well.
Very well. Great. Sylvain, un gros merci de m'avoir aidé. Écoute, je suis pas un expert en anglais, mais quand j'avais de la misère, là, t'étais d'une aide là, vraiment très, très, très appréciée.
C'est un privilège, Christian, d'avoir pris part à cette expérience. Beaucoup de respect pour ce que tu fais, puis autant pour Philippe, que j'apprécie énormément. C'est un plaisir, mon frère ami.
Good. Un gros merci à tous d'avoir été à l'écoute jusqu'à la fin. Puis encore une fois, un gros merci à M. Philippe Shaw de Dresden en Ontario. Donc sur ce, je vous dis à la prochaine. Merci beaucoup. Bye bye tout le monde. Okay, the record is ending.